The Hatfield-McCoy feud stands as one of the darkest, most infamous chapters in American history. Set in the rugged Appalachian Mountains along the border of West Virginia and Kentucky, this was no ordinary quarrel. It wasn't just a fight between two stubborn families. It grew into a bloody war that engulfed entire communities, split churches, poisoned friendships, and left dozens of bodies buried in its wake. By the time it reached its height in the 1880s, the feud had transformed the Tug Valley region into a battlefield, where neighbors turned into enemies, and vengeance became a way of life. But to truly understand why this feud became so legendary, we must see the larger picture. Post-Civil War America was fractured, not just politically but socially and economically. In these rural, mountainous lands, people lived hard lives, surviving on farming, logging, and hunting. Honor, loyalty, and family ties weren't just values, they were lifelines. Any insult, real or imagined, could erupt into violence, because for mountain families, reputation was everything. Against this backdrop, the Hatfields and McCoys were destined to collide. On one side stood the Hatfields, led by the strong, cunning patriarch William Anderson, Devil Anse Hatfield. A man of sharp instincts and commanding presence, Devil Anse was both respected and feared. His family owned land, timber, and had influence in West Virginia's Tug River Valley. They were proud, fiercely protective of one another, and quick to take offense. On the other side were the McCoys, led by Randolph "Randall" McCoy, a tough but less wealthy farmer from the Kentucky side of the border. The McCoys were hardworking, proud mountain folk, deeply tied to their land and family honor. Randall, unlike Devil Anse, didn't command the same resources or charisma, but his pride and stubbornness matched any Hatfield. What began as small disputes over land, over livestock, over honor, soon escalated into a cycle of revenge killings. Every bullet fired demanded another in return. Blood spilled on one side guaranteed more blood would flow from the other. This was not just about family pride anymore. It became a generational war, with children growing up knowing they were expected to hate and fight the other side. Newspapers of the time sensationalized the feud, portraying it as a barbaric relic of mountain lawlessness, a symbol of America's untamed frontier spirit. To outsiders, it was a shocking story of savagery. To those who lived in Tug Valley, it was daily life, a reality written in blood and sorrow. And so the Hatfield-McCoy feud wasn't just a quarrel. It was a war without rules, without mercy, and without end, until the land itself seemed to bleed with the cries of the dead. To understand the Hatfield-McCoy feud, we must first step into the world where it was born, the Tug Valley, a remote stretch of land straddling the West Virginia-Kentucky border. In the late 1800s, this wasn't a place of bustling towns or modern comforts. It was wild, rugged, and isolated, locked in by the Appalachian Mountains and thick forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. Life here was hard, unforgiving, and shaped by the land itself. The people who lived in these mountains were descendants of Scotch-Irish settlers, fiercely independent and deeply attached to their families. They lived off farming, hunting, and timber work. Communities were small, sometimes just a scattering of cabins along a riverbank. There were no big cities nearby, no strong government presence, and very little law enforcement. That meant families were the law. If someone wronged you, there was no sheriff to call, no court you could trust. Justice was delivered personally, often through the barrel of a gun. And in a land where every mouthful of food came from your own sweat, resources mattered. Land disputes weren't just arguments over property lines, they were battles for survival. Livestock wasn't just wealth, it was a family's lifeline. To steal a hog or a cow was no small crime. It was to attack a man's honor, his ability to feed his children. The Civil War had just torn America apart, and its wounds were still fresh in Tug Valley. Families had been split, brothers had fought on opposite sides, and loyalties remained bitterly divided. Some supported the Union, others the Confederacy, and the echoes of those choices haunted the region long after the war had ended. Resentments ran deep, fueling distrust and hostility between neighbors. This environment bred a culture of honor and retaliation. Reputation was everything. If someone insulted your name, your family, or your loyalty, you were expected to defend it, often with violence. A man who didn't protect his family's honor risked being seen as weak, a shame that would stain his children and grandchildren. In such a culture, small sparks could ignite massive fires. The Hatfields and McCoys thrived in this unforgiving setting. They weren't just two families living across the Tug River from one another. They were symbols of two ways of life, two prides, and two stubborn wills locked in a deadly struggle. Their neighbors weren't neutral bystanders either. Most chose a side. Whole towns split down the middle, with churches, courts, and even schools divided along family loyalties. In this crucible of isolation, hardship, and honor, the seeds of the feud found fertile soil. The land itself, harsh, beautiful, and lawless, helped shape the conflict into something far greater than a private dispute. It turned a family quarrel into a war that captured the attention of the entire nation. The Tug Fork of the Big Sandy River was more than just a winding stream of water cutting through the Appalachian Mountains. It was a natural dividing line that separated two states, two communities, and eventually, two warring families. On one side of the river lay Logan County, West Virginia, where the Hatfields built their homes, farms, and timber businesses. On the opposite bank, in Pike County, Kentucky, stood the homesteads of the McCoys. The river was narrow enough to cross, but wide enough to mark a boundary that both united and divided the people who lived along its banks. For the people of Tug Valley, the river was life itself. It watered their crops, carried their timber, and provided fish for their tables. Yet it also became a symbolic border of identity. To the Hatfields, the West Virginia side was their domain, their stronghold. To the McCoys, the Kentucky hills represented their heritage and pride. While geography separated them by only a few yards of water, the cultural and emotional distance between the two sides was vast. Economically, Tug Valley in the late 19th century was poor and underdeveloped. The land was steep and rocky, making large-scale farming nearly impossible. Families scratched out a living with small plots of corn and beans, raising hogs and chickens for food. Men often turned to timbering or coal work to make ends meet. This scarcity of resources meant that disputes over land boundaries, livestock ownership, or even hunting rights carried enormous weight. A single hog could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Adding to this tension was the lack of reliable law enforcement. Pike County and Logan County were both remote and far removed from strong state control. Courts existed, but they were weak, inconsistent, and often influenced by powerful families like the Hatfields and McCoys themselves. Justice wasn't impartial, it was political, and more often than not, it favored the side with the most guns, money, or influence. The Hatfields, with Devil Anse's leadership and success in the timber industry, held more power and wealth on the West Virginia side. They were seen as dominant, even intimidating by their neighbors. The McCoys, while hardworking and proud, did not have the same economic clout. This imbalance planted seeds of resentment, making every slight and every dispute feel like a battle for dignity. The physical isolation of Tug Valley further magnified these tensions. With no railroads, poor roads, and limited communication, conflicts brewed in private and escalated without outside intervention. News traveled slowly, often distorted, and rumors became weapons as dangerous as rifles. A whispered insult could become a sworn oath of revenge by the time it reached the opposite bank of the river. Thus, Tug Valley was not merely a backdrop, it was the crucible of the feud. The harsh mountains, the dividing river, the scarcity of resources, and the absence of law all conspired to turn a series of personal grievances into one of the bloodiest family wars in American history. The Hatfield family wasn't just another mountain clan living along the Tug Fork River, they were a force. In the late 1800s, under the leadership of William Anderson, Devil Anse Hatfield, they stood as one of the most influential and feared families on the West Virginia side of Tug Valley. To outsiders, they were often painted as ruthless, violent outlaws. But to those who lived under their protection and within their circle, the Hatfields were strong, loyal, and proud, a family bound by unbreakable ties and unyielding will. Devil Anse Hatfield was the beating heart of the clan. Born in 1839, he had fought in the Civil War, serving in the Confederate Army and later leading a guerrilla unit. The war hardened him, sharpening both his instincts and his authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, with piercing eyes and a commanding presence, Devil Anse carried an aura that could silence a room. Some said his nickname came from his fierce temper, others from his cunning mind and fearless bravery in battle. Either way, the title Devil wasn't an insult, it was a warning. By the 1870s, Devil Anse had carved out success in the timber industry. His logging operations gave him both wealth and influence, something rare in the isolated Appalachians. Land, livestock, and connections were all under his control. In a place where strength was everything, Devil Anse's power was both respected and feared. His family and allies looked to him for leadership, while his enemies cursed his name. The Hatfields themselves were a large and tight-knit clan. Brothers, sons, cousins, and in-laws all formed a web of loyalty. They were known for their sharp tempers, quick fists, and willingness to defend family honor at all costs. In Tug Valley, the Hatfield name carried weight, sometimes enough to tilt court cases, other times enough to silence accusers. If you crossed them, you weren't just facing one man. You were facing an entire army bound by blood. But with power came enemies. Many in Kentucky saw the Hatfields as arrogant bullies who used their influence to bend justice in their favor. The fact that Devil Anse lived just across the Tug River made tensions worse. His wealth and dominance cast a long shadow over the poorer McCoys on the opposite bank. To the McCoys, the Hatfields represented not just a rival family, but the embodiment of everything unfair in Tug Valley: wealth, control, and unshakable pride. Yet Devil Anse was not a one-dimensional villain. Those who knew him spoke of his loyalty to family, his generosity to friends, and even his later years of religious faith when he renounced violence. But in the 1870s and 1880s, the years of the feud, he was a man forged by war, driven by honor, and unafraid to spill blood if it meant defending the Hatfield name. The stage was set. On one side of the river stood Devil Anse and his formidable clan, wealthy, powerful, and unyielding. On the other side waited the McCoys, proud, stubborn, and burning with resentment. All it would take was a spark, and the mountains would erupt in fire. Across the Tug Fork in the rugged hills of Pike County, Kentucky, lived the McCoy family. Unlike the wealthier and more influential Hatfields, the McCoys were farmers, ordinary mountain folk, toughened by poverty and hardship. Their survival depended on small plots of land, livestock, and sheer determination. But what they lacked in riches, they made up for in pride and an unbending sense of honor. The head of this clan was Randolph McCoy, known to everyone as Randall. Born in 1825, Randall was a stubborn and hardworking man who carried the burden of leading a large family. He was not wealthy, nor particularly charismatic like Devil Anse Hatfield. Instead, Randall was defined by his grit and resilience. He believed in justice, in standing his ground, and in defending his family's name, no matter the cost. Yet beneath his determination, there was a certain vulnerability, a sense of always being overshadowed by the Hatfield's power. Randall had his share of personal struggles. His marriage to Sarah McCoy brought him many children, 13 in total. Feeding and raising such a large family in the mountains was no small task. Every crop, every hog, every acre of land mattered to their survival. When resources were threatened, Randall reacted fiercely, often with bitterness. To him, every dispute wasn't just about property, it was about dignity. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, especially when living across the river from the mighty Hatfields. The McCoys were known throughout Pike County as hardworking, religious, and tightly bonded, but they also had tempers. Like the Hatfields, they followed a strict code of family loyalty. If one McCoy was insulted, the entire clan carried the insult, and if blood was spilled, the debt would be repaid in kind. In a culture where reputation was everything, the McCoys refused to bow their heads, even if it meant standing against a stronger rival. To outsiders, the McCoys sometimes seemed tragic, forever struggling, forever outmatched. But to themselves, they were proud mountain folk, determined to defend their land, their honor, and their children's futures. Randall McCoy in particular was haunted by feelings of injustice. He believed the law was often bent by men like Devil Anse Hatfield, leaving families like his vulnerable. That sense of unfairness would fuel his bitterness and harden his resolve as the feud escalated. Neighbors often said that if Devil Anse represented power, Randall represented endurance. The Hatfields might dominate with wealth and numbers, but the McCoys had an unyielding spirit. They would not be intimidated. They would not back down. Thus, on opposite banks of the Tug River stood two men, Devil Anse Hatfield and Randall McCoy, each the embodiment of his family's pride and values. One rich in power, the other rich in defiance. Together, they were destined to drag their clans into a storm of violence that would scar the land for generations. The roots of the Hatfield-McCoy feud stretched far deeper than a stolen hog or a family romance. To truly understand its fury, we must go back to the Civil War, a conflict that ripped not only the United States apart but also divided families across the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia. Tug Valley was no exception. Here, the war didn't just end with surrender, it lingered, festering like an open wound, shaping grudges that would eventually erupt into bloodshed. During the war, loyalties in Tug Valley were split. Some families supported the Union, believing in preserving the United States and opposing slavery. Others threw their lot in with the Confederacy, fighting for Southern independence and their way of life. In a community where kinship meant everything, these choices weren't just political, they were personal betrayals. Brothers sometimes fought against brothers, cousins against cousins. The war left scars that did not heal when the guns fell silent in 1865. The Hatfields largely sided with the Confederacy. Devil Anse Hatfield himself became a Confederate guerrilla fighter, commanding a unit that carried out raids and ambushes across the rugged terrain. His leadership earned him respect among Confederate sympathizers, but also the fear and hatred of Union supporters in the region. For the Hatfields, the war solidified their reputation as fighters who commanded loyalty and demanded obedience. The McCoys, however, leaned toward the Union cause. Randall McCoy and many of his kin were either sympathizers or served alongside Union forces. This immediately put them at odds with their Hatfield neighbors across the Tug River. Even after the war ended, the bitterness of those allegiances lingered. One early flashpoint was the murder of Anse McCoy, Randall McCoy's brother, who had served in the Union Army. Returning home after the war, Anse was ambushed and killed in 1865 by men believed to be Confederate sympathizers, possibly connected to Devil Anse's circle. Though Devil Anse himself wasn't directly blamed, many McCoys suspected Hatfield hands were behind the murder. This death planted the first seed of lasting hatred between the two families. The Civil War had done more than split the country. It had left behind an atmosphere of suspicion, vengeance, and unresolved justice. In the Tug Valley, where law was weak and grudges ran deep, old battle lines were redrawn in everyday life. The Hatfields carried the pride of Confederate veterans. The McCoys carried the pain of Union losses. Neither side forgot. Neither side forgave. So while newspapers would later point to livestock disputes and romances as the start of the feud, the truth is darker. The war had already poisoned the soil. The deaths, the betrayals, and the loyalties formed in blood created a climate where violence seemed inevitable. The Civil War might have ended on paper, but in Tug Valley, it had only just begun. If the Civil War had left deep scars across Tug Valley, then the murder of Anse McCoy was the wound that refused to close. In January 1865, just as the war was drawing to its bloody conclusion, Anse returned home to Pike County, Kentucky. He was weary, injured, and walking with the pride of having served in the Union Army. For the McCoys, Anse was a symbol of loyalty to the Union cause. But to the Hatfield side, staunch Confederate supporters, he was seen as a traitor in their own backyard. Anse return was not welcomed by everyone. Rumors swirled that he had been marked for death. In those days, hostility toward Union veterans ran strong in Confederate sympathizing regions of Appalachia. Anse had not only fought for the Union, but had earned the contempt of local guerrillas who despised everything he represented. Among these guerrillas was a man named Jim Vance, Devil Anse Hatfield's uncle, notorious for his violent temper and ruthless ways. One cold night in 1865, Anse sought shelter in a cave near his home, fearing for his life. His fears were justified. He was hunted down, ambushed, and shot dead. Though Devil Anse himself later denied involvement, many pointed fingers at his associates, especially Jim Vance. The McCoys believed the Hatfields had sanctioned the killing. Whether or not Devil Anse gave the order, the connection was enough to light a fire of suspicion and hatred. The murder of Anse McCoy carried immense symbolic weight. To the McCoys, it was not just the loss of a brother. It was an attack on their honor, their loyalty, and their bloodline. Randall McCoy never forgot or forgave this death. From his perspective, the Hatfields had drawn first blood. Even though no formal justice was delivered in the unwritten law of the mountains, the killing demanded vengeance. For the Hatfields, the situation was more complicated. Anse's service in the Union Army and his open defiance of Confederate sympathizers had already made him a target. To them, his killing was seen less as a personal feud and more as a lingering continuation of Civil War hostilities. Yet, regardless of justification, the stain of suspicion fell squarely on their family. Newspapers and storytellers later framed Anse death as the true spark that ignited the feud. While tensions between the Hatfields and McCoys had existed before, this was the first time blood had been shed directly between the clans. It set a precedent. When one side lost a life, the other would demand repayment. And thus, a cycle began. One death leading to another, vengeance feeding vengeance. In that frozen winter of 1865, the mountains of Tug Valley echoed with the first shot of what would become America's most infamous family war. Asa Harmon McCoy's grave was not just the resting place of a soldier, it was the birthplace of a feud. By the 1870s, the Civil War was over, but its bitterness still lingered across Tug Valley. The Hatfields and McCoys were not openly at war during this decade, but the feud was quietly smoldering beneath the surface. It was a time when land disputes, inheritance quarrels, and simmering resentments began to turn neighborly suspicion into outright hostility. For mountain families, land wasn't just property, it was survival. The steep Appalachian slopes offered little fertile soil, and every acre mattered. Families passed land down from one generation to the next like sacred treasure, but boundaries in the mountains were often unclear. Lines were drawn by rivers, trees, or old markers that shifted over time. This made land ownership a constant source of dispute, especially when prideful men like Anse Hatfield and Randall McCoy were involved. The Hatfields, thanks to Anse's growing timber business, had begun to prosper. He acquired land and used it for logging, a valuable industry in a region rich with forests. With money and influence flowing his way, Anse expanded his power across the West Virginia side of the Tug Fork. This success did not sit well with the McCoys, who struggled to maintain their modest farms on the Kentucky side. To Randall, every acre the Hatfields claimed felt like a shadow creeping over his family's dignity. Inheritance disputes also added fuel to the fire. Stories circulated of contested wills, family property, and who had rightful claim to certain tracts of land. In mountain culture, even a small piece of disputed land could stir rage because it was tied to family honor. If a man lost land in a quarrel, he wasn't just losing property, he was losing face. The two families also lived in a world where loyalty networks mattered as much as blood. Each clan had allies, friends, and neighbors who owed them favors or shared their grudges. Slowly, the Hatfields and McCoys became the centers of two rival camps, each ready to stand with their chosen family in times of trouble. This meant that any dispute between a Hatfield and a McCoy could quickly spiral into a community-wide conflict. Though the 1870s did not yet see the explosive bloodshed that would later define the feud, this was the decade when the foundation was laid. The Hatfields, growing wealthier and more confident, looked down the river with dominance. The McCoys, proud yet struggling, looked back with envy and resentment. The land itself seemed to embody their rivalry, one side rich in resources, the other side scraping to hold on. By the end of the decade, the feud needed only a spark to explode. That spark would come in the form of a seemingly small but deadly serious accusation, the theft of a hog. By 1882, tensions had been brewing for years between the Hatfields and McCoys. Small quarrels, land disputes, and even the lingering bitterness of the Civil War were enough to keep the families at odds. But the true explosion came on Election Day in August 1882, a day that would forever stain the history of the Tug Fork Valley. It all began when three of Randolph McCoy's sons, Talbert, Farmer, and Bud, encountered Ellison Hatfield, the younger brother of Anse Hatfield. The McCoy boys were already nursing resentment and had reputations for being hot-headed. On what should have been a peaceful day of voting, drinking, and community gathering, words were exchanged. No one recalls the exact insult, but witnesses later testified that a petty argument quickly spiraled into violence. Knives were drawn, fists flew. In a brutal assault, the McCoy brothers stabbed Ellison Hatfield 26 times before shooting him once in the back. Somehow, Ellison survived the initial attack, bleeding and battered, clinging to life. He was carried away and the community held its breath. Would he live or die? For the Hatfields, the situation was a nightmare. The attackers were McCoys, and if Ellison died, vengeance would be inevitable. But instead of handing the McCoy brothers over to law enforcement right away, the Hatfields decided to hold them captive until Ellison's fate was clear. For 3 agonizing days, the men waited as Ellison's life hung by a thread. Then came the moment that shattered all chances of peace. Ellison Hatfield succumbed to his wounds. The Hatfields, consumed by fury and grief, saw only one path forward: revenge. Without trial or mercy, Devil Anse and his men dragged the 3 McCoy brothers to the woods along the Kentucky side of the Tug Fork. They tied the men to pawpaw bushes and executed them in cold blood, filling the trees with the sound of gunfire. The killing of the McCoy brothers was more than retaliation. It was a declaration of war. From this point on, the feud was no longer about land, pigs, or politics. It was about blood for blood. Every family member, every neighbor, every ally would be forced to take sides. The valley changed overnight. The McCoys cried murder and demanded justice. The Hatfields defended their actions as rightful vengeance. In a region where law enforcement was weak and loyalties ran deep, the feud transformed into a brutal cycle of retribution. The death of Ellison Hatfield marked the true beginning of the blood feud. What had once been whispers of hostility erupted into one of the most infamous family wars in American history. The execution of Randolph McCoy's 3 sons in August 1882 sent shockwaves through the Tug Fork Valley. To the Hatfields, it was justice served for the brutal killing of Ellison Hatfield. To the McCoys, it was nothing short of cold-blooded murder. What followed was not just a feud between 2 families. It was the unraveling of an entire region. Randolph "Randall" McCoy was devastated. He had just buried 3 of his sons, their young lives cut short not by war or accident but by the hands of their neighbors. His grief quickly hardened into rage. To him, Devil Anse Hatfield had crossed a line that could never be forgiven. McCoy swore revenge, and with his vow, the feud entered a dark new chapter. The killings divided the community. On the Kentucky side, most locals sided with the McCoys, demanding arrests and calling the Hatfields out as murderers. On the West Virginia side, many supported the Hatfields, insisting they had simply avenged Ellison's death. The border became more than a river. It became a fault line of loyalty and hatred. But this was Appalachia in the 1880s. The law was weak, and the courts were often powerless against powerful families with deep connections. Arrest warrants were issued, but Hatfield supporters ensured they were ignored or delayed. Time and again, justice slipped through the cracks, leaving only vigilante action to fill the void. And so, one killing led to another. McCoy supporters began plotting ambushes against Hatfield men, while the Hatfields retaliated with their own. What had started as a tragic election day brawl soon turned into a cycle of revenge. Homes were burned, property was destroyed, and families lived in constant fear of the next attack. Even worse, the conflict began to draw in allies beyond blood. The Hatfields rallied neighbors, cousins, and hired hands, swelling their numbers into a formidable band. The McCoys did the same, appealing to Kentucky lawmen and other local families who despised the Hatfields. What began as a personal feud was evolving into a miniature war. By late 1882, the feud was no longer contained. The very air in the Tug Fork Valley seemed poisoned by suspicion and hatred. A Hatfield walking into Kentucky risked being shot on sight. A McCoy venturing too close to West Virginia faced the same fate. It was clear now. There would be no reconciliation, no truce, no handshake over a pig or a line of land. The Hatfield-McCoy feud had transformed into something far more dangerous, a vendetta where only blood could settle the score. The valley braced itself for the storm to come, and when it came, it would leave fire, ashes, and death in its wake. By the time the three McCoy brothers were buried in late 1882, the Tug Fork Valley was no longer a place of neighbors. It was a battlefield divided by a river. What had begun as bitter words and small quarrels had now escalated into open warfare, and both families began to prepare as if for a war between nations. Devil Anse Hatfield, once a Confederate guerrilla fighter during the Civil War, was no stranger to leading men in combat. He had lived through the violence of the battlefield, and now he drew on those same tactics to defend his kin. Gathering his brothers, cousins, and trusted allies, Devil Anse began building a force that resembled a militia more than a family. These were not ragtag farmers with pitchforks. They carried rifles, pistols, and the hardened discipline of men who had fought in war. On the other side, Randolph McCoy, though not as militarily experienced as Devil Anse, refused to sit idle. His grief had transformed into a mission, the destruction of the Hatfields. Randolph began rallying allies throughout Pike County, Kentucky. Some were extended kin, others were men who despised the Hatfields, growing influence, and feared their dominance along the Tug Fork. Soon, the McCoys too had a fighting force of their own, backed by sympathetic lawmen and Kentucky officials who wanted to see the feud end in favor of law and order. But this was not law and order, it was frontier justice at its darkest. Skirmishes began to erupt. At night, shots rang out across the valley. Livestock was stolen, homes were torched, and innocent family members found themselves caught in the crossfire. For every Hatfield wronged, a McCoy would be targeted. For every McCoy insulted, the Hatfields would retaliate with double the fury. The families operated like military units. The Hatfields, with Devil Anse at their head, relied on ambushes and guerrilla tactics, surprise attacks that left their enemies shaken and bloodied. The McCoys, backed by Kentucky officials, attempted more formal raids, but these often turned chaotic, leaving destruction in their wake. Perhaps the most dangerous development was the way the feud drew in outsiders. Men who had no direct stake in the quarrel began choosing sides, either for pay, revenge, or loyalty. The feud was no longer Hatfields against McCoys. It was West Virginia against Kentucky, neighbor against neighbor, all wrapped in a cloud of mistrust and bloodshed. The transformation was complete. These were no longer two families quarreling over pigs or election fights. They had become armies, sworn to destroy one another, and the violence, now organized and relentless, would only grow bloodier with time. The stage was set for some of the feud's most infamous and deadly clashes, ones that would scar the Tug Fork Valley for generations. As the dust of 1882 settled, the Hatfield-McCoy feud shifted from personal vengeance into organized terror. No longer confined to the heat of arguments or drunken brawls, the conflict spilled into calculated raids designed to break the other family's spirit. And with every attack, the valley's fragile peace collapsed further. The Hatfields struck first. Under the leadership of Devil Anse, they used their knowledge of the mountain terrain to their advantage. Slipping across the Tug Fork at night, Hatfield men targeted McCoy farms, destroying property and livestock while firing warning shots into the air. Their goal was simple: send a message that crossing the Hatfields came with deadly consequences. The McCoys, however, were not cowed. Randolph McCoy gathered his sons and loyal allies, organizing retaliatory raids deep into West Virginia territory. These raids were not mere warnings, they were intended to kill. At times, entire groups of men moved stealthily under cover of darkness, rifles ready, hunting Hatfields like soldiers in a campaign. Neighbors who once traded goods or worked side by side now peered across fences with suspicion. Was that man a Hatfield sympathizer? Was that boy running errands for the McCoys? Every interaction became a question of loyalty, and neutrality was almost impossible. Choosing no side was often seen as betrayal to both. The first major bloodshed of these raids came in late 1882 and early 1883. A group of McCoys ambushed Hatfield allies, sparking a gunfight that left men wounded and the valley echoing with rifle fire. Soon after, Hatfield partisans retaliated, chasing McCoy supporters across the Kentucky border. These were not isolated incidents. They were rehearsals for something far worse. What made these raids especially terrifying was the sheer unpredictability. Families would wake in the middle of the night to flames engulfing their barns or hear bullets shattering windows. Children cried out as their parents gathered them under beds, praying the violence would pass them by. No one in the Tug Fork Valley slept easily. Lawmen on both sides tried to intervene, but their power was weak. Sheriffs were often relatives or friends of the feuding families, making impartial justice nearly impossible. Warrants were issued, but few arrests were made. In truth, the feud had grown too large for the law to contain. These early raids hardened both families' resolve. The Hatfields believed intimidation would crush McCoy resistance. The McCoys believed their cause was righteous, and that only relentless pressure could bring the Hatfields to heel. Neither side realized they were feeding a beast that would soon devour them both. By 1883, the feud was no longer whispers of hostility. It was open war, and the blood that had been spilled so far was only the beginning. By the early 1880s, most outsiders believed the Hatfield-McCoy feud was nothing more than a family quarrel gone horribly wrong. But beneath the surface, darker forces were at play, forces of land, wealth, and power that transformed private grudges into a regional war. The Tug Fork Valley wasn't just a place of cabins and farms. It was rich in timber, coal, and fertile land. And in a time when America's industrial hunger was growing, those resources meant money. Money that powerful families like the Hatfields and McCoys wanted to control. The Hatfields, led by Devil Anse, had carved out significant influence on the West Virginia side. Devil Anse himself was not just a fighter, but also a shrewd businessman. He owned large tracts of timberland and had contracts with logging companies eager to exploit the mountains. His success gave the Hatfields wealth and status that extended beyond the valley, making them a powerful force in regional politics. The McCoys on the Kentucky side were not nearly as wealthy. Randolph McCoy was respected but not rich. Many in his family struggled as small-scale farmers, living off the land while watching the Hatfields prosper across the river. This economic imbalance only deepened resentment. To the McCoys, the Hatfields weren't just enemies, they were symbols of greed and domination. And then came the land disputes. The border between Kentucky and West Virginia ran straight through disputed valleys and ridges, making ownership murky. Surveys were contested, deeds were challenged, and suddenly, family loyalties determined who owned which patch of forest or farmland. In these disputes, the Hatfields often had the upper hand. With stronger political ties in Logan County, West Virginia, they could sway courts and local officials to their side. The McCoys, frustrated by legal defeats, saw the feud not only as a matter of blood, but also as a fight for survival against an enemy using wealth and influence as weapons. It wasn't long before timber rights became a central battleground. By 1885, the Hatfields had lucrative logging deals that gave them steady income. The McCoys had little to match it, and their resentment boiled over. Each raid, each ambush, was not just an act of vengeance. It was a strike against a family that seemed to be thriving while others starved. The feud's ties to economics are often overlooked, but they explain why it grew so fierce. This wasn't simply about honor or revenge. It was about control of the Tug Fork Valley itself, its land, its resources, its future. For both families, losing the feud meant more than humiliation. It meant losing everything. And as money and politics tangled themselves into the feud, the violence would only escalate. Soon, blood and fire would not just stain the valley, it would threaten to consume it entirely. While the feud is often told as a story of violent men, rifles, and revenge, the women of the Hatfield and McCoy clans played roles just as important, sometimes as victims, sometimes as peacemakers, and sometimes as sparks that made the fire burn even hotter. Life in the Tug Fork Valley was already harsh for women. They managed households, raised children, tended to farms, and endured the constant fear of poverty or hunger. When the feud erupted, their burdens doubled. Every knock at the door could mean danger. Every distant gunshot could signal the death of a brother, son, or husband. Yet despite this, women's actions often shaped the course of the conflict in ways history could never ignore. The most famous example came with Roseanna McCoy, daughter of Randolph McCoy. In the mid-1880s, she fell in love with Johnse Hatfield, the handsome son of Devil Anse. Their romance was the stuff of Appalachian legend, two young lovers caught between rival families, their passion stronger than the hatred that surrounded them. For a brief moment, it seemed that love might bridge the divide between the clans. But reality crushed that hope. When Roseanna ran away to live with Johnse, the McCoys felt betrayed, believing their daughter had sided with the enemy. And when Johnse eventually abandoned Roseanna, returning to the Hatfield fold, she was left broken, pregnant, disgraced, and caught between two families who now despised her choices. Her child, born of love across enemy lines, did not survive infancy. Roseanna's tragic story became symbolic of the feud itself. Love poisoned by mistrust, unity destroyed by vengeance. Other women endured the feud differently. McCoy wives and daughters suffered when their homes were raided or burned. Some watched their loved ones executed or dragged away, powerless to intervene. Hatfield women faced their own fears, often sheltering fighters or nursing wounded men after nighttime ambushes. For them, the feud was not just fought in the woods or fields. It invaded their kitchens, their beds, their lives. Yet women were not always silent victims. Some urged restraint, begging their husbands and sons to lay down arms. Others demanded revenge just as fiercely as the men. There are accounts of McCoy women sharpening knives or Hatfield women swearing oaths of loyalty to their family's cause. The feud may have been fought by men, but women carried its emotional and social weight on their shoulders. Perhaps most tragically, Women became bargaining chips in the feud's power struggles. Roseanna's fate proved how fragile love was in a world dominated by vengeance. Every romance, every marriage, even every child born was seen through the lens of loyalty, Hatfield or McCoy. Neutrality was impossible. In the end, the women of the feud were both witnesses and casualties, their lives forever scarred by decisions they never asked for but could never escape. Their grief and endurance remain one of the feud's most haunting legacies. By the mid-1880s, the Hatfield-McCoy feud was no longer just about blood ties or personal grudges. It had become deeply entangled with politics. The Tug Fork Valley straddled two states, West Virginia and Kentucky, and each side of the border carried its own loyalties, laws, and ambitions. What began as a family war now pulled in sheriffs, judges, and even governors. The Hatfields, with Devil Anse as their leader, held strong influence in Logan County, West Virginia. Many of his allies were ex-Confederates like him, hardened men who had fought in the Civil War and now dominated local politics. His cousin, Anderson Cap Hatfield, was a fierce fighter and one of his chief enforcers, but the real political power came from Bad Frank Phillips, a Kentucky deputy who eventually became the McCoys' most notorious ally. With figures like these at play, the feud crossed from backwoods disputes into the dangerous arena of politics and law enforcement. Elections became flashpoints. In a region where votes determined who controlled courts, lawmen, and land rights, both families pushed hard to sway results. The Hatfields often used their numbers and intimidation to dominate Logan County elections, ensuring that warrants for their arrests rarely carried weight. Meanwhile, the McCoys leaned on Pike County's political figures in Kentucky, demanding justice and pressing for action against the Hatfields. This created a deadly imbalance. On the West Virginia side, the Hatfields felt shielded by their influence, knowing they could often dodge Kentucky warrants once they crossed the river. On the Kentucky side, the McCoys seethed with frustration, convinced that corruption and cowardice allowed the Hatfields to get away with murder. It wasn't long before Kentucky officials began to push harder, seeing the feud not just as a family quarrel, but as a chance to make a political statement about law and order. Corruption ran deep. Some lawmen took bribes, looking the other way during raids or ambushes. Others openly chose sides, carrying out arrests on behalf of one family while ignoring the crimes of the other. The feud became less about justice and more about which side could manipulate the law most effectively. For the McCoys, political failure meant survival rested in their own hands. For the Hatfields, political control only emboldened their aggression. Every election season brought fresh tension, new violence, and the lingering sense that the feud was no longer just personal. It was a war fought in ballots as well as bullets. By the late 1880s, the feud had reached a boiling point. It wasn't just families at war. It was Kentucky versus West Virginia, courts versus vigilantes, and politics versus survival. And soon, this political tug-of-war would unleash one of the most infamous bloodbaths of the entire feud. By the late 1880s, the Hatfield-McCoy feud had become a storm without mercy. Every year seemed to bring fresh blood, and every killing guaranteed another in return. Small ambushes escalated into open attacks, and the valley lived under the constant shadow of death. But nothing compared to what was building, an eruption that would culminate in one of the darkest nights in Appalachian history. The Hatfields, emboldened by their political power in Logan County, carried out attacks with brutal precision. They no longer waited for insults or quarrels. Instead, they struck strategically, often targeting McCoy allies in Kentucky to weaken Randolph-McCoy's standing. Reports of barns burned, cattle stolen, and men shot on lonely roads spread fear across Pike County. Meanwhile, the McCoys, growing desperate, leaned on their Kentucky allies for support. Men like Bad Frank Phillips, a relentless deputy, became key players in the feud. Phillips was no ordinary lawman. He was a fighter with a taste for blood, willing to cross the West Virginia border to hunt Hatfields, even if it meant defying legal boundaries. To the McCoys, he was a savior. To the Hatfields, he was an outlaw with a badge. The cycle of ambushes became relentless. One night, a Hatfield supporter would be gunned down while tending his farm. Days later, McCoy partisans would find themselves surrounded in the woods, their bodies left as grim warnings. It was not war in the traditional sense. It was guerrilla combat, fueled by rage, carried out in the silence of the mountains. By 1887, Randolph McCoy had lost sons, allies, and the stability of his household. His family lived in constant fear, barricading themselves at night, always listening for footsteps outside. The Hatfields, for their part, saw Randolph as the source of the feud's persistence. As long as he lived, he would demand vengeance. The attacks escalated in cruelty. It wasn't enough to kill. Men wanted to send messages. Some victims were left mutilated. Others were shot in front of their families. Every act of violence was a declaration that the feud was far from over. Then came whispers of something darker. The Hatfields, led by Devil Anse's sons, began plotting a strike so devastating it would crush the McCoys once and for all. Their eyes turned toward Randolph McCoy's home itself, the heart of the family, the place where their enemy slept. The valley could feel it. The feud was reaching its breaking point. Ambushes had scarred the land, but what was coming would be more than a raid or a warning. It would be a massacre, a night of terror that would haunt Appalachian memory for generations. And on New Year's Eve of 1888, that nightmare came to life. December 31, 1887, should have been a night of celebration in the Tug Fork Valley. Families across Kentucky and West Virginia prepared to welcome the new year, hoping for peace and prosperity. But at the McCoy cabin in Pike County, Kentucky, there would be no peace. That night, the Hatfields unleashed an attack so savage that it entered legend as the darkest chapter of the feud. In the days leading up to New Year's Eve, Devil Anse Hatfield's sons, led by Cap Hatfield and Johnse Hatfield, devised a plan to strike directly at their enemy's heart. Their target was Randolph "Randall" McCoy, the patriarch who had sworn endless vengeance for his slain sons. To the Hatfields, killing Randolph would end the feud once and for all. But what they carried out went far beyond assassination. It was slaughter. Just before dawn, as the McCoy family slept, a band of Hatfields crept silently through the icy darkness toward the cabin. The night was bitter cold, snow crunching underfoot, their rifles loaded and torches ready. Inside, Randolph, his wife Sarah, and their children huddled together, unaware of the terror that was descending upon them. The Hatfields surrounded the home and opened fire. Bullets ripped through the wooden walls as the McCoys scrambled to defend themselves. Randolph leapt from his bed, seizing his rifle, but the Hatfields pressed their assault. Then, in a move that turned the raid into a massacre, they set the cabin ablaze. Flames roared into the night sky as the McCoy family screamed, trapped inside their burning home. Two of Randolph's children, Calvin and Alifair McCoy, were gunned down as they tried to flee. Alifair, barely grown, was shot dead on the porch, her body falling lifeless into the snow. Calvin was struck by rifle fire and collapsed before he could escape the inferno. Randolph himself was beaten nearly to death, but managed to crawl into the woods, bloodied and broken. His wife, Sarah, was left with a fractured skull after being struck in the head. The Hatfields fled as flames consumed the cabin, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. By the time neighbors rushed to the site, the McCoy home was a smoldering ruin, with the lifeless bodies of Calvin and Alifair lying in the ashes. The valley awoke to the news, and shock turned quickly to fury. The New Year's Eve massacre shocked even those who had once supported the Hatfields. What might have been framed as vengeance had become butchery. The killing of children and the burning of a family home crossed a line that Appalachia would never forget. Instead of ending the feud, the massacre ensured it would spiral out of control. Now the law itself, which had long been powerless, could no longer ignore the bloodshed. Warrants would soon be issued, posses would be formed, and the feud that had once belonged to two families was about to become a manhunt across state lines. The New Year's Eve massacre was the point of no return. From that night forward, the feud would no longer be contained to the Tug Fork Valley. It would capture the attention of the entire nation. By 1888, the Hatfield-McCoy feud had spiraled so far out of control that it no longer resembled a family quarrel. It had become open warfare. Blood had been spilled on both sides, houses burned to the ground, and innocent lives lost. Local militias began forming, and one of the bloodiest encounters of the entire feud would erupt along Grapevine Creek in Pike County, Kentucky. After the brutal New Year's Night massacre of 1888, where the Hatfields had stormed the McCoy home, killing two of Randolph McCoy's children and severely injuring his wife, Kentucky authorities could no longer stand by. Governor Simon Buckner of Kentucky called for justice, and Pike County posses were organized to track down the Hatfields. These weren't just lawmen. They were armed groups of McCoy supporters, hungry for revenge and determined to end the feud once and for all. Devil Anse Hatfield and his sons, knowing they would soon face retaliation, gathered their allies deep in the rugged mountains near Grapevine Creek. They were prepared for battle, armed with rifles, revolvers, and the ruthless determination of men who had already lost too much. But the Kentucky posse, guided by Frank Phillips, a fierce McCoy ally, was equally determined. On the cold winter morning of January 19, 1888, the two forces clashed in a chaotic firefight that echoed across the Appalachian hills. Gunfire ripped through the forest, and for hours the two sides exchanged volleys. Bullets struck trees, ricocheted off rocks, and tore through the frozen earth. Men dove for cover behind stumps and boulders, shouting curses and firing wildly. When the smoke finally cleared, the Hatfields were forced into retreat. Several of their men were captured, including Jim Vance's allies, while others fled into the mountains. The Battle of Grapevine Creek marked the turning point in the feud. For the first time, the Hatfields had suffered a decisive defeat. The McCoys, though battered and broken by years of tragedy, finally tasted a measure of justice. But victory came at a heavy cost. Grapevine Creek was stained with blood, and the feud had escalated into something far larger than any family rivalry. Now, it was a war that had drawn in governors, militias, and national headlines. Would you like me to continue section 19 in the same style, 400-500 words, carrying forward the aftermath of Grapevine Creek, the trials, arrests, and the beginning of the legal showdown? The aftermath of the Battle of Grapevine Creek left the Hatfields shaken and weakened. For years they had dominated the feud with ambushes, assassinations, and ruthless raids, but now the tide had turned. Kentucky wasn't simply looking the other way anymore. This time, the state government itself stepped in to crush the violence. Governor Simon Buckner of Kentucky demanded that the Hatfields be brought to justice. But there was a problem. Most of the Hatfields lived across the Tug Fork River in West Virginia, out of Kentucky's legal reach. For months, heated arguments erupted between the two states. Kentucky lawmen insisted that the Hatfields should face trial in Pike County, while West Virginia authorities accused them of crossing the border and kidnapping their citizens illegally. What had begun as a bloody family feud now threatened to spark a legal war between two states. Leading the charge for justice was Frank Phillips, the relentless McCoy ally who had commanded the posse at Grapevine Creek. With the backing of Kentucky officials, Phillips launched daring raids into West Virginia territory, capturing Hatfield men wherever he could find them. His methods were bold, sometimes bordering on reckless. He would ride deep into the mountains, confront armed Hatfield allies, and drag prisoners back across state lines. It was dangerous, it was controversial, and it inflamed tensions like never before. By late 1888, several Hatfields had been captured and placed in Kentucky jails, including Valentine Wall Hatfield, Devil Anse's own brother. Wall had long been a trusted leader among the Hatfields, but now he sat behind bars awaiting trial. Alongside him were others accused of participating in the New Year's Night Massacre and the Grapevine Creek Battle. For the first time, the law was striking at the very heart of the Hatfield clan. In January 1889, the trials began in Pikeville, Kentucky. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, townsfolk, and grieving families all crowded in to witness history. The McCoys demanded blood, the Hatfields demanded fairness, and the entire nation was watching. Newspapers from New York to Chicago sent correspondents to cover what they called America's greatest family feud. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, every outburst in court made headlines. The prosecution painted the Hatfields as ruthless murderers who had turned Pike County into a battlefield. They focused especially on the New Year's night attack on the McCoy cabin, where Alifair and Calvin McCoy had been slain. Witnesses described the fire, the screams, and the merciless gunfire. The Hatfield defense countered that the McCoys had struck first, and that Devil Anse's men were only protecting their families. But sympathy in the courtroom leaned heavily toward the McCoys, who had suffered terrible losses. The trials were far from over, but the message was clear. The feud was no longer just a private war. It was now a matter of law and order, and the United States legal system was finally forcing the Hatfields to face judgment. Yet, as the trials dragged on, one burning question remained. Would Devil Anse himself, the fearsome patriarch, ever stand before a judge? As the trials unfolded in Pikeville, all eyes turned to the question no one could avoid. Who would pay the ultimate price for the Hatfield-McCoy feud? Blood had been spilled on both sides, but the court needed someone to blame for the carnage, someone whose punishment would signal that the era of lawlessness was ending. Among the Hatfields captured after Grapevine Creek was Ellison Cotton Top Mounts, the illegitimate son of Ellison Hatfield. Cotton Top was simple-minded, often mocked even by his own kin, and had long been treated as the black sheep of the clan. But during the infamous New Year's Night Massacre of 1888, witnesses claimed they saw him pull the trigger that killed Alifair McCoy as she ran from her burning home. That single act would seal his fate. In court, the prosecution made Cotton Top the face of Hatfield brutality. They argued that his actions proved the Hatfields had crossed every line of decency, attacking women and children in their own home. The defense tried to plead insanity, pointing to his slow wit and childlike behavior, but the jury was unmoved. In 1889, Cotton Top Mounts was sentenced to hang. The execution was carried out in Pikeville on February 18, 1890. Thousands of spectators gathered on a cold winter morning to witness the event. For many McCoy supporters, it was the justice they had long demanded. As Cotton Top stood on the gallows, he reportedly confessed to his crime, but insisted that Devil Anse and the older Hatfields had led him astray. His last words were said to be hauntingly simple: "The Hatfields made me do it." Moments later, the trapdoor opened, and Cotton Top's body swung lifeless in the air. His death marked the only official execution directly tied to the feud, but its symbolism was immense. For the McCoys, it was a grim victory, proof that their suffering had not gone unanswered. For the Hatfields, it was a bitter reminder that the law had finally pierced their mountain stronghold. And yet, even as Cotton Top's body was laid to rest, one man remained untouchable: Devil Anse Hatfield. Despite his role as the mastermind and patriarch of the Hatfield clan, he managed to avoid capture. Shielded by his allies, his reputation, and the rugged wilderness of West Virginia, Devil Anse retreated further into the mountains. To the McCoys, it was an infuriating injustice. To the Hatfields, it was proof that their leader could never be broken. But while he escaped the hangman's noose, Devil Anse could not escape the weight of what the feud had cost him. His family was scattered, his reputation stained, and his name forever tied to bloodshed. The feud had begun as a personal rivalry, but now, with Cotton Top's execution, it had ended as a national spectacle of law, violence, and tragedy. With Cotton Top Mounts hanging from the gallows in 1890, the Hatfield-McCoy feud reached a breaking point. For decades, blood had answered blood, but now the appetite for vengeance was waning. The trials, the imprisonments, and the execution had drained both families. The mountains that once echoed with rifle fire now carried the silence of exhaustion. Randolph McCoy was a broken man. He had buried children, seen his home go up in flames, and watched his family scatter in fear. Though he lived until 1914, the fire that once fueled his rage had burned out long before. He spent his later years consumed by sorrow, clinging to his Bible, haunted by the memory of his slain children. The McCoys had demanded justice, and while Cotton Top's execution brought them a measure of it, Randolph knew nothing could truly heal his losses. On the other side, Devil Anse Hatfield was also weary. Once the towering patriarch of a clan feared across the Tug Fork Valley, he had seen his family destroyed by a feud he could no longer control. His sons had been jailed, his men hunted, and his community dragged into endless cycles of retribution. Slowly, Devil Anse withdrew from the fight. The same man who had sworn vengeance after his brother Ellison's death now grew tired of endless bloodshed. The 1890s brought change not only for the families but also for the region. The timber and coal industries were beginning to transform Appalachia, and law enforcement tightened its grip on once isolated mountain communities. The era of lawless clan wars was fading, replaced by courts, contracts, and commerce. Both states, Kentucky and West Virginia, pushed for peace, knowing that the feud had scarred their reputations nationwide. The turning point for Devil Anse came in 1911, when, after a lifetime of violence, he shocked the region by being baptized into the Baptist Church. Standing in the waters of Island Creek, the once feared leader who had ordered raids, ambushes, and killings stood humbled, declaring himself a servant of God. To many, it was the ultimate sign that the feud was truly over. Though tensions between the families lingered, open warfare had ended. The Hatfields and McCoys still carried grudges, whispered stories of betrayal and memories of lost kin, but the cycle of blood had finally been broken. The feud had claimed more than a dozen lives, destroyed homes, and poisoned an entire valley. But at last peace, however uneasy, had settled over the Tug Fork. The world outside the mountains was already moving on, but for those who lived through it, the scars of the feud would never fade. In the quiet of the Appalachian hills, the ghosts of Hatfields and McCoys remained, reminding future generations of the terrible price of vengeance. By the early 1890s, the guns had grown quieter along the Tug Fork, but the Hatfield-McCoy feud was far from forgotten. While the families were burying their dead and trying to rebuild their shattered lives, the outside world was watching with fascination. What had begun as a backwoods dispute over land, pigs, and pride had exploded into national headlines, turning two Appalachian families into symbols of lawlessness and revenge. Newspapers from New York, Chicago, and even across the Atlantic in London ran stories about the feud. Reporters painted vivid pictures of wild mountaineers locked in a bloody struggle, describing them as barbaric clans and hillbilly warriors. The truth was often twisted or exaggerated. Numbers of the dead were inflated, motives were simplified, and entire battles were dramatized for the sake of a good story. But readers didn't care about accuracy. They were hungry for tales of blood and betrayal. The feud was sensationalized to such a degree that it became a shorthand for violence in America. Editorials compared it to the vendettas of old Europe, likening the Hatfields and McCoys to medieval families locked in endless warfare. Political cartoons mocked both sides, drawing caricatures of bearded mountain men clutching rifles, fighting over moonshine or livestock. In urban centers, where people had little understanding of Appalachian life, the feud became a symbol of backwardness, an image that would haunt the region for generations. But not all coverage was mockery. Some journalists portrayed the feud as a tragedy born from isolation, poverty, and the failure of law enforcement. They pointed out how geography, steep mountains, rough terrain, and remote valleys allowed the violence to thrive unchecked. Others used it as a cautionary tale about what happens when grudges go unchecked, when honor outweighs forgiveness, and when justice is left in the hands of revenge. The press attention had a powerful effect on the families themselves. The Hatfields and McCoys, once private mountain clans, now found themselves under the glare of national scrutiny. Strangers traveled to Pike County and Logan County just to catch a glimpse of them. Tourists even visited feud sites, curious to see the hills and hollows where so much blood had been spilled. What was once a tragedy had become a strange kind of entertainment. By the turn of the century, the phrase Hatfields and McCoys was no longer just a reference to two families. It had entered American culture as a symbol of senseless feuding. Neighbors turned to enemies, vengeance passed from father to son, and peace lost to pride. The feud was history, yes, but it had also become legend. And legends once born never die. By the late 19th and early 20th century, the Hatfield-McCoy feud was no longer just a tragic chapter in Appalachian history. It had transformed into a piece of American folklore. The real blood, the real grief, and the real bodies buried in the Tug Fork Valley slowly gave way to stories, tall tales, and eventually, entertainment. What had once been whispered in fear around campfires was now retold in plays, books, and eventually motion pictures. Writers and folklorists seized upon the feud as a symbol of the wild mountains. In dime novels and pulp magazines, the Hatfields and McCoys were reimagined as larger-than-life figures, fearsome, vengeful, and untamed. The facts mattered less than the drama. A single gunfight might be described as a full-blown battle, and the characters were exaggerated into heroes or villains depending on the storyteller's bias. This romanticized retelling ensured the feud lived far longer in memory than it ever did in reality. The feud's cultural reach only grew with the rise of Hollywood. By the 1920s and 1930s, silent films and later talkies began referencing the Hatfields and McCoys as shorthand for bitter, comic rivalries. In many cases, Hollywood stripped away the tragedy and replaced it with slapstick humor, portraying feuding mountain folk firing rifles at weddings, squabbling over moonshine, or chasing each other across hilltops. To moviegoers in cities, the names Hatfield and McCoy meant funny, bumbling hillbillies, not grieving families who had lost children to fire and bullets. Even cartoons jumped on the legend. Animated shorts in the mid-20th century spoofed the feud, often with rival families of animals fighting endlessly. The feud became an easy punchline in American comedy, a cultural reference everyone recognized even if they didn't know the bloody history behind it. Yet beyond the humor, the feud also inspired serious works. Historians, playwrights, and Appalachian writers began to reclaim the story, stripping away the exaggerations to examine the deeper causes: poverty, honor, land disputes, and the absence of law in remote mountain regions. They reminded the world that behind the legend were real men and women, scarred forever by a cycle of vengeance. The phrase Hatfields and McCoys became an American metaphor. It was used in politics to describe bitter rival parties, in sports to describe heated rivalries, and even in families to describe siblings who never stopped fighting. The feud had become more than history. It was now a language, a symbol of conflict that resonated far beyond the mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia. The blood feud that left dozens dead had been transformed by culture into something eternal. It was no longer just a story of Appalachia. It was a story of America itself. As the 20th century marched on, the Hatfield-McCoy feud refused to die. Long after the rifles had fallen silent and the blood had dried on the hillsides of Kentucky and West Virginia, the story continued to haunt the region. But instead of bullets and revenge, it now lived on in memory, in tourism, and eventually in reconciliation. By the mid-1900s, the feud had become a source of fascination for outsiders. Travelers curious about America's most famous family war began flocking to Pike County, Kentucky, and Logan County, West Virginia. Locals, realizing the interest, started to embrace the legend. Tours were organized to take visitors to feud sites: the ruins of Randolph McCoy's cabin, the graves of Hatfield family members, and the rough terrain where ambushes had once taken place. Hotels and restaurants along the Tug Fork began using the feud as a selling point. Even local festivals adopted the names Hatfield and McCoy to draw crowds. What had once been a mark of shame was now becoming a strange kind of economic lifeline. But beyond money, there was something deeper: a need for healing. For generations, the Hatfield and McCoy descendants carried the burden of their ancestors' choices. Family gatherings often came with whispered stories and lingering bitterness. Yet as time passed, many descendants wanted to put the feud to rest. In 1976, a symbolic truce was signed between Hatfield and McCoy descendants at a public ceremony. It was a powerful gesture, signaling that while the past could never be forgotten, the future could be built on peace. The truce did not erase the rivalry entirely. There remained a playful edge. In later decades, events like tug-of-war contests, marathons, and even ATV races between Hatfield and McCoy descendants turned the feud into friendly competition. What was once deadly was now celebrated with laughter, food, and music. The feud's legacy also inspired pop culture tourism. In the 21st century, attractions like the Hatfield and McCoy Dinner Show in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee, brought the story to new audiences. Meanwhile, TV documentaries, books, and the History Channel's 2012 miniseries starring Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton reignited worldwide interest. Suddenly, millions who had never set foot in Appalachia were talking about Devil Anse, Randolph McCoy, and the feud that had defined them. Through it all, the families themselves learned to carry their history with pride. They were no longer just the victims and perpetrators of a bloody mountain war. They were survivors, keepers of a story that had become bigger than them, part cautionary tale, part legend, part living history. The feud that had once divided them was now, ironically, the very thing that united them in memory. Though the bullets stopped flying by the end of the 19th century, the Hatfield-McCoy feud left behind scars that ran much deeper than graves and burned cabins. For the children and grandchildren of both clans, the feud became a shadow that followed them through life. It wasn't just history, it was identity. Imagine being born a McCoy or a Hatfield in the Appalachian Hills in the early 1900s. Even if you never held a rifle or lived through the bloodshed, the name itself carried weight. Children were teased at school, judged by their surname, and sometimes even feared. Neighbors whispered about which side you belonged to. Generations of descendants carried this invisible burden, forced to inherit a war they never asked for. For the McCoys, the trauma often came in the form of loss and grief. Stories of murdered brothers, sisters, and children became family lore, retold with tears and bitterness. Randolph McCoy's broken spirit seemed to echo through his descendants, many of whom grew up in the shadow of his tragedy. To be a McCoy was to remember injustice. For the Hatfields, the burden was different. They had not only suffered losses, but also carried the stigma of being branded as outlaws. Devil Anse might have escaped the gallows, but his name became synonymous with violence. His children and grandchildren grew up with the uneasy knowledge that their family was remembered as aggressors, as mountain raiders who set fire to a rival's home. Many Hatfield descendants struggled to balance pride in their family's resilience with shame over its reputation. Psychologists today would call it generational trauma, a cycle where the pain, fear, and anger of one generation seep into the next. In Appalachia, where oral storytelling was strong, the feud's tragedies were passed down not just in history books, but in the quiet moments of family gatherings. A child might sit at their grandmother's knee and hear about the night McCoy children died in the flames, or how Hatfield men were hunted across the mountains. These weren't just stories. They were warnings about loyalty, pride, and vengeance. Yet strangely, the feud also gave both families a unique identity. Being a Hatfield or a McCoy meant being part of something larger than yourself, something legendary. It brought a sense of belonging, even if that belonging was forged in blood. Over time, as reconciliation efforts grew, descendants found strength in reclaiming the story, not as a tale of endless hate, but as a lesson about forgiveness and resilience. The psychological impact of the feud reminds us that violence never truly ends with the last gunshot. Its echoes live on in memory, shaping generations in ways seen and unseen. For the Hatfields and McCoys, the feud was more than history. It was a shadow stitched into their very bloodline. The Hatfield-McCoy feud did more than scar two families. It shaped how the entire Appalachian region was viewed by the outside world. Long before television or the internet, the feud's bloody headlines traveled far, and with them came a lasting stereotype. The image of the backwoods hillbilly, violent, lawless, and trapped in endless cycles of revenge. To city newspapers in the late 1800s, Appalachia was already mysterious, a rugged land of coal, timber, and poverty, largely cut off from the rest of the nation. The feud became the perfect story for them to sensationalize. Articles painted the Hatfields and McCoys not as complex families dealing with poverty and honor, but as caricatures, bearded mountain men with rifles and moonshine jugs feuding over livestock and pride. This exaggerated picture gave birth to one of America's most enduring stereotypes, the feuding hillbilly. The stereotype suggested Appalachians were primitive, uneducated, and prone to violence. The truth, of course, was far more complicated. The Hatfields and McCoys were not mindless fighters. They were landowners, Civil War veterans, and farmers living in a time of deep economic hardship and legal weakness. But nuance rarely sells newspapers. Violence does. As Hollywood grew in the 20th century, this stereotype solidified. Cartoons and films portrayed mountain families forever locked in comic feuds, shooting at weddings, and chasing one another with shotguns. The tragic reality of children burned alive or men ambushed in the woods was erased, replaced with slapstick comedy. To millions of Americans, Appalachia became synonymous with backwardness. This stereotype had real consequences. For decades, Appalachians faced ridicule, their culture dismissed as violent and uncivilized. Poverty in the region was blamed not on economic exploitation by coal companies, but on the supposed laziness or violence of its people. Politicians used the feud as a symbol of why Appalachia needed civilizing. And yet, ironically, the same stereotype also gave Appalachia a cultural identity that outsiders couldn't ignore. The image of the rugged, rifle-carrying mountaineer became iconic, sometimes mocked, sometimes admired. It drew tourists, inspired writers, and gave the region a distinct place in American imagination. The Hatfield-McCoy feud became both a curse and a crown for Appalachia. It fueled damaging stereotypes but also kept the region in the spotlight. Even today, when someone mentions an old rivalry, the words like the Hatfields and McCoys immediately come to mind. The feud had turned into more than history. It became America's shorthand for conflict itself. More than a century later, the Hatfield-McCoy feud still refuses to die, not in violence but in memory. The hills where gunshots once echoed are now quiet, yet they draw thousands of tourists every year. From graveyards to historic cabins, the feud has transformed into both a solemn remembrance and a tourist attraction. In Kentucky, the McCoy homestead is preserved with a sorrowful silence. Visitors walk the grounds where the New Year's Night massacre took place in 1888, where Randall McCoy's home was set ablaze and two of his children murdered. The site is both a shrine to tragedy and a reminder of how revenge can consume entire generations. Not far away, the McCoy family graves, marked with modest stones, stand as eternal witnesses to a legacy of grief. Across the Tug Fork River in West Virginia, Hatfield landmarks tell their own side of the story. Devil Anse, Hatfield's grave, topped with a life-size Italian marble statue, is perhaps the most famous. The towering figure of the patriarch gazes out over Logan County, a symbol of the larger-than-life reputation he earned in life and in legend. Hatfield family cemeteries, old cabins, and court sites where trials were held are now part of heritage trails. In recent decades, both states have leaned into the story. The Hatfield-McCoy Trails, a sprawling network of ATV routes cutting through the Appalachian wilderness, borrow the feud's name to lure adventure seekers. Feud festivals and reenactments allow visitors to step back into the 1880s, often dramatizing the most infamous moments of ambush and betrayal. But tourism isn't only about entertainment. For local communities, it has become survival. The decline of coal mining left many Appalachian towns struggling, and feud tourism offered a lifeline. What was once a source of shame, a history of blood and fire, has been repackaged into heritage, giving families pride and outsiders a reason to visit. Still, there's an unease beneath the celebration. For descendants, the feud was no joke. It was their grandparents' blood spilled in the dirt. Some families embrace the tourism, selling feud memorabilia and hosting events, while others resent the commercialization of their ancestors' suffering. To them, it feels like tragedy turned into a carnival. Yet history has a strange way of surviving. Without tourism, the feud might have faded into dusty archives. Instead, the graves, markers, and memorials keep it alive, reminding visitors that what they see as legend was once someone's nightmare. The Hatfield-McCoy feud now exists in two worlds, one of mourning and one of spectacle, and in both, it continues to echo across the Appalachian hills. If the Hatfield-McCoy feud had ended quietly in the 19th century, it might have remained just another violent Appalachian story. But it didn't. It grew into legend, seeping into American culture, literature, and media for more than a century. What began as bloodshed between two families became a metaphor for endless rivalry, stubborn pride, and the darker side of human vengeance. By the early 1900s, newspapers and dime novels sensationalized the feud, turning the Hatfields and McCoys into household names. Writers exaggerated details, portraying the families as wild mountaineers locked in savage warfare. While often inaccurate, these stories captured the public imagination. For urban readers far removed from Appalachia, the feud became a symbol of the untamed American frontier, tragic, violent, and larger than life. In the 20th century, Hollywood picked up the tale. Movies like The Feud 1919 and Roseanna McCoy 1949 dramatized the story for the silver screen. Cartoons such as Looney Tunes and even the Flintstones created humorous parodies of feuding families, cementing the Hatfield-McCoy name as shorthand for comic bickering. By the mid-century, the feud was so ingrained in American pop culture that even children knew Hatfields and McCoys meant endless fighting. Television revived the story in new ways. Documentaries explored the real history behind the myth, and in 2012, the History Channel's three-part miniseries Hatfields and McCoys, starring Kevin Costner and Bill Paxton, shattered viewership records. It brought back the grit and brutality of the feud, forcing audiences to see the human cost behind the legend. For many modern viewers, this series was their first encounter with the real bloodshed beneath the cliché. The feud has even influenced music and sports. Country ballads recall the tragic killings, while sports teams use the Hatfields and McCoys as symbols of rivalry, invoking the families' names whenever two groups clash fiercely. The phrase, "a real Hatfield-McCoy situation," has become an American idiom, instantly understood as a metaphor for bitter, never-ending conflict. Yet not all portrayals are accurate or respectful. Many descendants argue that pop culture caricatures their ancestors as hillbillies, stripping away the grief, poverty, and political pressures that fueled the violence. What for outsiders is a joke or a drama was, for the families, a wound that never fully healed. Still, the cultural afterlife of the feud proves one thing. It transcended its Appalachian roots to become part of the American identity. Just as Romeo and Juliet represent doomed love, the Hatfields and McCoys represent doomed hatred. Their names are no longer just surnames. They are symbols. Symbols of how pride, once unleashed, can outlive even the people who started it. Today, the Hatfield-McCoy feud is more than just a violent chapter of the past. It has become part of the cultural DNA of Appalachia. To the people of West Virginia and Kentucky, the story isn't simply a tale of murder and revenge. It's a reflection of their history, their hardships, and their resilience in the face of stereotypes. For decades, Appalachia has been painted by outsiders as backward, lawless, and uneducated, a place where moonshiners and gunfighters ruled the mountains. The Hatfield-McCoy feud, sensationalized by newspapers and Hollywood, only added fuel to that image. For many Appalachians, this has been both a burden and a point of defiance. On one hand, the feud cemented unfair stereotypes of violent hillbillies. On the other, it gave the region a mythic identity, one of fierce independence and unbreakable loyalty to family and land. In small Appalachian towns, you'll still hear people talk about the feud with pride or sorrow, depending on their perspective. Some families trace their lineage to Hatfields or McCoys, and for them, the feud is personal history. It's not just a story in a book. It's the reason their grandparents whispered about long-lost cousins or kept grudges alive long after the last shot was fired. Others embrace it as a shared heritage, proof that Appalachia has its own legends just as powerful as those of the Wild West. Economically, the feud has helped shape modern Appalachia as well. Tourism around feud landmarks and ATV trails has given struggling coal towns a new industry. Where once mines were the lifeblood of the region, now storytelling is. Locals act as tour guides, narrators, and caretakers of feud history, turning tragedy into livelihood. This shift has brought a sense of pride. Appalachia may have been wounded by its past, but it also found a way to survive through it. Culturally, the feud has become a lesson, a reminder of what unchecked anger and pride can do to communities. Schools in the region sometimes use the feud as a teaching tool, encouraging young Appalachians to see beyond stereotypes and to understand the real human costs of revenge. For many, it's a way to reclaim the narrative to say, yes, this happened here, but it doesn't define us forever. At the same time, the feud continues to shape Appalachian identity in subtle ways. The strong family bonds, the emphasis on loyalty, and the suspicion of outsiders all echo the values that once fueled the conflict. The land itself seems to remember. When you stand by the Tug Fork River or walk through the pine-shaded cemeteries, it feels as though the mountains are still whispering the names Hatfield and McCoy. In the end, the feud's legacy in modern Appalachia is both curse and crown. It shackles the region to a bloody past, yet it also gives Appalachians a story of endurance, a way to show the world that from blood-soaked soil, resilience can still grow. The Hatfield-McCoy feud may belong to the 1800s, but its lessons echo loudly in today's world. At its heart, the feud wasn't just about land, pigs, or politics. It was about family pride, unresolved grudges, and the unwillingness to forgive. And those same forces still shape conflicts in families and communities today. Think of modern family disputes, inheritance battles, custody fights, business rivalries between relatives. While they may not involve rifles and ambushes, they often stem from the same seeds that fueled the Hatfield-McCoy War: pride, jealousy, and the refusal to back down. Just like the Tug Fork Valley families, people today can allow small disagreements to fester into generational wounds. Psychologists often point to the Hatfield-McCoy feud as a classic case study of escalation. A single spark, the disputed pig, the Civil War loyalties, the forbidden romance, ignited cycles of revenge that neither side could stop. Each act of retaliation justified the next, until the feud consumed not only the fighters but their children and neighbors as well. This cycle of vengeance is something families today must guard against. Once bitterness becomes tradition, it becomes almost impossible to end without deliberate forgiveness. Modern families can also learn from how pride turned tragedy into legacy. Both Hatfields and McCoys were so committed to defending their honor that they sacrificed peace, prosperity, and even their own loved ones. Today, too many families repeat that mistake. Instead of choosing compromise, they cling to the need to win. The feud shows us that in family conflicts, winning often means losing everything that matters. But there's a hopeful side, too. The eventual reconciliation of Hatfield and McCoy descendants in the 20th and 21st centuries proves that no conflict is truly unbreakable. In 2003, for example, more than 100 descendants signed a symbolic peace treaty, turning centuries of hostility into a gesture of unity. This act became a reminder to the world. Even the bloodiest rivalries can end if both sides are willing to lay down pride. In today's culture, where family feuds can play out publicly on social media or in courtrooms, the Hatfield-McCoy story serves as a warning and a guide. It warns us of what happens when pride rules over reason. It guides us toward the possibility of reconciliation, even when forgiveness feels impossible. At its core, the feud teaches that family bonds are both fragile and sacred. Once broken, they can destroy generations, but if protected, they can outlast any storm. The Hatfields and McCoys showed us the cost of hatred. Their descendants show us the power of healing. In the grand sweep of American history, the Hatfield-McCoy feud stands out not just as a bloody family war, but as a mirror reflecting the nation itself. The feud is more than a regional tale. It is a story about who Americans were in the 19th century, and in many ways, who they still are today. At its roots, the feud reveals the tension between lawlessness and justice in frontier America. In the late 1800s, the Appalachian backcountry was a place where government authority was weak, where families enforced their own codes of honor, and where revenge often replaced the courtroom. This was the frontier spirit, self-reliance taken to its darkest edge. In this way, the Hatfields and McCoys represent the broader struggle of a young America trying to decide. Would it be ruled by law or by blood ties and vengeance? The feud also symbolizes the wounds left behind by the Civil War. Both families had split loyalties. Hatfields largely fought for the Confederacy, McCoys for the Union. Even after the war ended, those divisions never healed. Instead, they transformed into local grudges, proving that the Civil War's battles weren't confined to the battlefield. They lived on in the hearts and hatreds of families across the South and border states. In this sense, the feud reflects how America itself struggled to reconcile after its greatest national conflict. Culturally, the feud is a symbol of the American obsession with rivalry. Just as Americans later celebrated Yankees versus Red Sox, Democrats versus Republicans, or Coke versus Pepsi, the Hatfields versus McCoys became the ultimate rivalry. It captured the imagination because Americans understand conflict. They see themselves in it, whether in sports, politics, or business. The feud reminds us that America was built not only on cooperation, but also on competition and struggle. Yet the feud is also a warning. It shows what happens when freedom and pride go unchecked. America prides itself on individuality and honor. But the Hatfields and McCoys show that when those values harden into stubbornness, they can destroy communities. In that sense, the feud isn't just a story of Appalachia. It's a story of America's shadow side, the cost of letting pride outweigh unity. Today, historians, teachers, and even politicians still reference the feud. It has become a symbol of America's contradictions: freedom and lawlessness, loyalty and vengeance, resilience and destruction. Like the Wild West gunfights or Salem witch trials, the feud is a chapter that speaks to the nation's identity. The Hatfield-McCoy feud reminds America of its deepest truth, that the line between honor and chaos is razor thin. And when that line is crossed, even the strongest families, communities, and nations can tear themselves apart. For more than a century, historians and scholars have debated the Hatfield-McCoy feud, asking the same questions. Why did it happen? Who was right? And what does it really tell us about America? The answers are as tangled as the mountains where the feud unfolded. Early writers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries often painted the feud as nothing more than mountain savagery. They claimed it was proof that Appalachia was backward, lawless, and uncivilized. This stereotype of violent hillbillies stuck for decades, cementing the feud as a symbol of primitive violence. But modern scholars have pushed back against that idea, arguing that the feud was far more complex. Historians today emphasize the larger forces at play. The Civil War left scars that ran deep. Hatfields and McCoys weren't just two angry families. They were part of a community still bitterly divided between Union and Confederate loyalties. The mountains of Kentucky and West Virginia weren't simply lawless. They were neglected by weak governments that failed to enforce justice. In that vacuum, families created their own systems of honor and vengeance. Some scholars also highlight economic pressures. The Tug Fork Valley wasn't just a stage for personal grudges. It was a battleground for land ownership, timber rights, and survival in a poor, isolated region. When industries like timber and coal began eyeing Appalachia's resources, the feud families found themselves both protectors and victims of land disputes. The famous stolen pig story may have been the spark, but many historians argue it was really about deeper struggles over wealth and power in a changing America. Psychologists who study conflict see the feud as a textbook example of escalation. Small acts of violence created cycles of revenge that became impossible to stop. Each death demanded retaliation. Each retaliation demanded more blood. From this perspective, the feud wasn't senseless. It was tragically logical. It followed the same destructive rules that still drive gang wars, political rivalries, and even international conflicts today. Another scholarly debate centers on responsibility. Was Devil Anse Hatfield truly a villain, or a leader trying to protect his family? Was Randolph McCoy a noble victim, or a man whose stubborn pride worsened the bloodshed? Historians rarely agree. What's clear, however, is that both families suffered equally. Both became prisoners of their own hatred. Today, scholars use the feud not to mock Appalachia, but to understand it. It's studied in classrooms, dissected in books, and explored in documentaries as an example of how poverty, politics, war, and pride can converge to create violence. Instead of calling it backward, modern historians see it as tragically human, a story that could have happened anywhere when law, forgiveness, and reason fail. The scholar's verdict: the feud wasn't just about Hatfields and McCoys. It was about America itself, its divisions, its failures, and its endless struggle to rise above violence. For generations, the feud cast a long shadow over the Hatfield and McCoy families. Children grew up hearing whispers of who killed whom, of betrayals never forgiven, and of blood debts unpaid. But in the modern era, descendants on both sides have chosen a different path, one not of revenge, but of reconciliation. The turning point came in the late 20th century, as both families began to realize that their shared story had become a worldwide symbol of bitterness. Instead of carrying the shame of endless violence, some descendants decided to turn it into a lesson of healing. In 1976, the two families came together for a public reunion, something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. For the first time, Hatfields and McCoys shook hands instead of raising rifles. The most symbolic moment arrived on June 14, 2003, when more than 100 descendants gathered in Pikeville, Kentucky, to sign a peace treaty. This was not a legal document, but a public declaration that the feud was over. The descendants recognized that, while they could never erase the pain of the past, they could set an example for future generations. Newspapers around the world covered the story, amazed that a conflict that began in the 1800s had finally been laid to rest in the 21st century. Beyond symbolic treaties, the families also embraced cooperation. They began organizing annual Hatfield-McCoy reunions and festivals, where descendants and tourists could gather for storytelling, food, and reenactments. What once was a cause of division became a shared heritage. For younger family members, these events were not about anger, but about honoring history and building bridges. There have even been lighter-hearted reconciliations. In the 1970s and 1980s, the families faced off in game shows and public competitions, not with guns, but with trivia and tug-of-war contests. These playful rivalries helped shift the narrative. The Hatfields and McCoys could still compete, but now it was in good spirit. For many descendants, reconciliation also meant reclaiming dignity. They wanted the world to see that their families were more than killers, that they were farmers, coal miners, teachers, and ordinary people who survived extraordinary tragedy. By participating in historical preservation and tourism, the descendants ensured that the story was told with respect, not mockery. The peace didn't erase the past, it acknowledged it. Both families had suffered, both had lost too much. But in choosing reconciliation, the Hatfields and McCoys sent a powerful message. Cycles of hate can end, even if it takes over a century. Their journey from bloodshed to peace has become as much a part of the feud's legacy as the gunfights themselves. In the end, the descendants proved something their ancestors could not: that forgiveness, though delayed, is stronger than vengeance. The Hatfield-McCoy feud may have been born in the isolated hills of Appalachia, but its story has traveled far beyond the Tug Fork Valley. What began as a bloody family conflict in the late 1800s has grown into one of the most recognized rivalries in the world. Its name synonymous with bitter grudges and unstoppable conflict. By the early 20th century, newspapers as far away as London and Paris were already reporting on the feud. Foreign readers, fascinated by the idea of American mountaineers at war, devoured the sensational details. To Europeans, the story seemed almost medieval, a tribal clash in the mountains of a young nation that prided itself on progress and democracy. The irony that such violence could erupt in the United States only fueled international intrigue. In the decades that followed, the Hatfields and McCoys became cultural shorthand worldwide. Even people who knew little of Appalachian history understood the phrase, a real Hatfield-McCoy situation. It entered the global vocabulary as a metaphor for any long-running, bitter rivalry, from business disputes to political stalemates to sports rivalries. In countries as far apart as Australia and India, the names Hatfield and McCoy are used in headlines whenever two sides refuse to reconcile. The feud's global recognition reached new heights with film and television. Hollywood movies carried the story overseas, and the 2012 History Channel miniseries Hatfields and McCoys was broadcast internationally, breaking records in multiple countries. Audiences from Europe to Asia tuned in, shocked to discover that this violent saga was not fiction, but a piece of real American history. For many, it was their first encounter with the Appalachian world. Tourism also attracted international attention. Travelers from Canada, Germany, and Japan have visited feud sites in Kentucky and West Virginia, curious to see the graves, cabins, and battlefields they had read about. For local communities, it was astonishing to see foreigners arriving in tiny Appalachian towns to learn about their ancestors' war. The feud had become not just a regional story, but a global attraction. At a deeper level, scholars note that the feud resonates globally because it represents something universal, the destructive power of pride and vengeance. Every culture has its own version of family rivalries, blood feuds, and generational grudges. From the Balkans to the Middle East, people see echoes of their own histories in the Hatfield-McCoy saga. That universality is why the feud has never lost relevance. It speaks to human nature itself. Today, the feud is more than American folklore. It is a global symbol, studied in universities, referenced in international media, and recognized by people who may never set foot in Appalachia. From Kentucky hollows to distant continents, the Hatfield-McCoy feud continues to echo, proof that a family war in the mountains can become a legend understood across the world. The Hatfield-McCoy feud is not just history, it is philosophy written in blood. Beneath the gunfights and ambushes lies a timeless lesson about the human condition, that pride and vengeance, once unleashed, can destroy even the strongest of families, while forgiveness, though difficult, has the power to break the cycle of hate. At its heart, the feud was not about pigs, land, or even politics. It was about honor. For both the Hatfields and the McCoys, reputation was everything. To back down was to admit weakness. To forgive was to appear dishonorable. And so pride demanded action, and action demanded blood. In this way, both families became slaves to their own sense of dignity. What they thought preserved their strength only deepened their wounds. Philosophers from the Stoics to modern thinkers have warned of this trap. Seneca once wrote that anger is a form of temporary madness, and the feud proved him right. The Hatfields and McCoys allowed anger to become tradition, and tradition to become destiny. For decades, reason could not penetrate the storm. In clinging to revenge, they forgot the cost. Their children buried, their homes burned, their future poisoned. Revenge offers the illusion of justice, but in truth, it only multiplies suffering. Every killing that was meant to settle the score created another debt of blood. Like a fire consuming dry timber, the feud fed upon itself until nothing remained but ash. It is here the greatest lesson lies. Violence is never satisfied. It always demands more. And yet the story does not end in despair. The descendants of the Hatfields and McCoys prove that cycles of hate can be broken, even if it takes a century. By signing peace treaties, hosting reunions, and transforming tragedy into heritage, they showed the world that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the highest form of strength. To forgive is to free oneself from chains forged by others. In the feud's arc, we see a mirror of humanity's eternal struggle, between the pride that demands retribution and the wisdom that whispers restraint. The Hatfields and McCoys chose pride, and they suffered. Their descendants chose peace, and they healed. The philosophical truth is clear. Vengeance may satisfy the moment, but forgiveness secures the future. The feud reminds us that no matter how deep the wound, reconciliation remains possible. Hatred is inherited, but so is healing. The choice belongs to us. The Hatfield-McCoy feud began with whispers, but it ended as legend. What started as a quarrel over land, politics, and pride erupted into one of America's most infamous blood feuds. For 3 decades, the Tug Fork Valley was soaked in fear, suspicion, and blood. Families were torn apart. Children grew up knowing only hatred, and justice was replaced by vengeance. And yet, the story did not end in endless bloodshed. Generations later, descendants of both clans stood where their ancestors had once fallen, not with rifles in their hands, but with outstretched arms. They signed peace treaties, built monuments, and turned their families, suffering into a warning for all who would listen. The very feud that once symbolized division became a symbol of reconciliation. This is why the Hatfield-McCoy feud endures, not just as history but as a parable. It shows us the true cost of unchecked anger. It reminds us that once pride is given the power to dictate our actions, it can drag entire generations into the grave. But it also teaches us that peace, though fragile, is always possible. Hatred can last for decades, but forgiveness can last forever. So the question is not whether you will remember the feud. The question is, what will you carry from it? Will you repeat its mistakes, letting grudges consume you until nothing is left? Or will you learn from it, choosing restraint over rage, unity over division, and forgiveness over vengeance? Because in the end, the greatest victory of the Hatfields and McCoys was not who won or who lost. The greatest victory was that, at last, the feud ended. The story has been told, but its lesson remains eternal. Pride destroys. Revenge consumes. Forgiveness heals. And that is the true legacy of the Hatfield-McCoy feud.